Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Maximizing Donor Revenue Through Relevance. My name is Ron Cass. I'm the founder of Big River, and we are pleased to host this webinar, which is part of our series on bringing the best practices of e-commerce into the fundraising and development space. Throughout today's presentation, we encourage you to interact with our speakers by typing in questions and comments using the message pane at the top of your screen. We will be answering questions live, both during the event and after the presentation. We're also recording today's session, and we will make the link to the recording available to you after the event via email. We encourage you to refer back to it and to share it with your colleagues. Now, to introduce today's speakers. Sandra Zoratti is an author, speaker, and B2B marketer. Sandra is recognized in social business, brand leadership, and as a thought leader in the area of data-driven marketing. She published her book on data-driven marketing, Precision Marketing, Maximizing Revenue Through Relevance, in 2012. It's available via Amazon, where you can see a preview, and we encourage you to have a look at that. Sandra was honored as Colorado's Business Marketer of the Year for 2012. Steve Zinram is a certified fundraising executive. He joined the Case Alumni Association and Foundation as their executive director in September of 2011, after working as director of development at Clarion University Foundation from 2009 to 2011. At Mercyhurst College in Erie, PA, from 1998 to 2009. He was also the Director of Marketing and Development at St. Mary's Home of Erie from 1995 to 1998. Prior to that, Steve served as Director of Alumni Relations at Gannon University and Robert Morris College. And he began his career as Assistant General Manager of the Erie Cardinals Baseball Club, a Class A affiliate of the St. Louis Cardinals. Go Cubs, go. Now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Sandra Zoratti. Sandra?
Thank you so much, and good morning to everyone. You know, marketing and fundraising has really long been an art, and I think with the introduction of data and the ability to use data, it's now really a blend of art and science. And as you heard, it's something I call precision marketing. So I'm really thrilled to be able to talk with you about that and use some of the expertise that Steve has to share some real-world examples. I also think this is the first time that Steve gets to be first in alphabetical order, so I'm glad to be able to do that for you, Steve. So let's get started. What I think is most important today for fundraising and for marketing is really to talk about and measure how we get more return on investment. And in fundraising, that may really be return on dollars raised. Return on investment is really simple. To me, a marketer, it's revenue and it's expense. And so you want to minimize expense and maximize revenue in order to really get the best return on investment. And as a marketer, what matters to me then is really maximizing the revenue that I can get in the door in order to drive improvements in return on investment. Steve, did you have any comments on return on dollars raised? Okay. So I'm wondering if, Steve, you might be on mute. So I'm going to go forward and really talk about what's most important and what we all need and want, but what I think is growing in terms of being ever elusive. The first domino that really must fall in order to get more revenue is what we're all trying to get, and really that's called engagement. And the reason I believe that engagement is so difficult today from customers, from prospective donors, is that we have so much coming at us today that it's very difficult to get into the conversation, start building relationships that matter, and continue building those relationships because there are so many things vying for our attention, our time, and our dollars. So engagement today is really not around donor management, it's really around donor engagement because you want to have continual touch points versus just periodic touch points. So this is really about unleashing the revenue potential through ongoing, meaningful contact. Standing in the way of engagement are really three challenges. And the good news is there are only 3 challenges. The bad news is that really only 2 of them are within our control. The other two of them are actually outside of our control. I mean, one is absolutely one that we can impact. So challenge number one is really about control. Today, and this is not something that was true 10 years ago, today it is not your fundraising messages or your marketing messages that are really determining what gets attention and what gets ignored. It's really around a lot of the online voices and other messages and cutting through that clutter to really shape the message that you're trying to deliver, grab the attention, and really drive engagement. So this is, again, where you need the ongoing meaningful contact and the ability to cut through the clutter in order to really engage with prospective donors. The donors, or a customer, is now really the unquestionable God, and they all know it, and we all know it as consumers, for example. Our peer-to-peer networks are really a more powerful influencer today, and that is the influencer circle that you need to understand as you're trying to communicate with prospective donors. Challenge number two is noise, and this is, just to put it in perspective, something that I think is new in the last decade. We're really content rich and attention poor. So on average, I've seen different statistics, but I believe we are around 3,000 to 5,000 messages every single day that we are all bombarded with. So as we're trying to sort through those messages, fundraising and marketing is trying to sort through those messages and cut through and really create a meaningful connection and engagement. So our challenge is, how do you stand out among that noise in order to be heard and create engagement? And some facts that really show you the level of this noise is, first of all, in the online world, and this is older data, so there's probably an update that comes out on these numbers, every couple of weeks. But if you look at this, almost 300 billion emails, every single one of us is exposed to every single day. There's over 500 million Facebook updates, 400 million tweets, 2 million blog posts. I saw a data point that said a blog post is published every half a second. And I think it's IBM who says that 3 times every second we produce as much data as the entire file library in the Library of Congress, so their entire collection. So it's pretty staggering, really tough to wrap your mind around that and think about how much data is actually being produced. And I think that's something that is a little bit overwhelming, to be frank. And it's not really just the online world. It's also offline marketing, if you will, and messaging, and it's global. Traditional offline marketing messages, as you can see from this photo, really still clutter our world. They're competing for our eyeballs and attention, and this just increases our challenges as communicators to cut through that clutter. And then there's all the different channels coming at us. So it's email, it's video, it's direct mail, it's online ads, it's TV, radio, websites, blogs, signage, mobile marketing now. The channels alone can overwhelm, and I think that the proliferation of marketing channels has really created a cacophony of sight and sound, which really does not have an off switch. And I know that when Steve and I were talking, we were talking about multi-channel marketing now as a profession. So Steve, are you on now? Okay, I'll continue then because I can't hear you, Steve, as you've joined. I'm getting a little message that you have joined, and I know you were going to comment about the number of channels that are now available to us as marketers and communicators, but then you really have to look at the other side and say, as receivers of that messaging without the off switch, what does that really mean on an individual basis? So that's kind of a dire picture. And in my view, all we can really do is press on through. And the way that we do that is really talk about the one thing that can help you cut through that clutter. And to me, I've proven time and time again with so many different companies and types of businesses that relevance is the way that we actually cut through the clutter. And I don't think that relevance is a new concept. I think what's new is how we get to relevant. So the problem is increasing because attention is such a scarce resource. So when you get someone's attention, you need to use it wisely in order to get engagement. So the way we get relevant is also based on how we get relevant. And relevance really does require data. So as daunting as data may be for many of us, me included, by leveraging and utilizing data, you're able to get a competitive advantage, if you will, in order to develop messaging that is much more on target to your prospective donors and create an engagement. And I have a bunch of side-by-side tests with businesses who have tried business as usual versus using relevance. And time again, they're getting up to 2, 3, and 4-digit improvements in engagement. Everyone talks about data, but the truth is that data is really useless unless it is analyzed and insights are extracted from data. And these need to be actionable insights, which I'll talk about in a moment. It's the insights and using those insights to develop a relevant approach that's really going to drive the results. And in my experience, relevance absolutely drives improved return on investment. So what do I mean by relevance? I'm going to make it simple. I talk about relevance in 3 ways. First of all, it's the right message, so the content. For example, I have a friend, a male friend, who continues to get advertisements from a large retailer for their women's clothing line. That's a great example and sort of an extreme example of how the content is not the right content. So you want to message people with things that they care about, and you're going to figure that out by seeing how they behave and analyzing that data. Secondly, it's figuring out the right person. Who are the targets with the highest propensity to engage with you around your initiative or mission? A lot of times this can involve looking at who does engage with you and then finding lookalikes based on data so that you know the people with whom you're communicating would have a higher likelihood of reacting to the message that you're delivering to them. And lastly, it's at the right time. And this is a difficult one to figure out. Typically, companies will do it iteratively. So a very simple example is a restaurant in Chicago, Harold's Chicken Shack, which was trying to figure out the best timing for a promotion they were using as a mobile campaign. And they just did a bunch of tests and then measured where they were getting the best response and then maximized around that. So they looked at who is responding, where are they getting the revenue, and how can I maximize that? And by taking that iterative approach, they ran a mobile campaign, and in the first several months, they got 10,000 opt-ins, and they were able to generate a 53% redemption rate on their introductory offer and a 37% redemption rate on subsequent offers. It's a simple example of how you can use test, learn, do over in order to really maximize what type of response you're getting. So let's talk about maximizing return on investment or maximizing dollars. This is really based on a number of case studies and implementations that I've done personally. And what we see on the x-axis is really the result as measured by revenue, response, or return on investment. On the y-axis, what I'm really showing is sort of like an analytics continuum. What level of data analysis are you using and implementing in your communication? So the first one, as you see, I would classify as segmentation, where I've worked with companies when they used some of the basic segmentation in order to implement relevance in a campaign, they were able to generate a 2-digit uptick in revenue. So the one that I worked on here was with Best Western International, who basically implemented a very, I would say, 5th grade analytics on a campaign, and they generated 30+% improvement in the revenue generated from that campaign over business as usual. The next level of sophistication is what I call profiling. And this is where you do use that look-alike or twinning type of approach. So you say, what do my high-value donors look like? And how do I find more people who look like those high-value donors? And by high value, what I mean is those donors who want to continue connecting with your fundraising initiatives. So by finding people who look similar to them based on data, you're really going to improve your chances for getting a positive outcome. The last one would be called predictive. And this is where you are quite sophisticated in your approach because you are utilizing behavior that you capture in order to generate a way to predict when someone would be most likely to donate, the levels they would like to donate, the areas they would like to donate. Because you're using behavior, it's a much richer source of figuring out how people are most likely to behave. And it's amazing what analytics can do in terms of accuracy for predicting behavior. This is where I have seen up to a 4-digit return on investment versus business as usual. And if you think about this, it also involves knowing how to sort of cross-sell and upsell around different initiatives that you may have going on within your organization. One example I like to highlight is in the insurance industry. Typically, if they have a customer who is engaged on 1 to 2 products or offerings, that customer will most likely stay with the organization for about 2 years. If you can sell 3 different products to them or 3 different initiatives, they typically stay for 3 to 5 years. And when you are able to cross-sell and upsell to 4 different offerings, the loyalty rate rises to about 7 to 10 years. So if you think about the lifetime value of a donor and how you keep them engaged using relevance and using different ways and different aspects to engage them, that really can help in terms of the loyalty and sustainability. So predictive is based on behavior, and everybody would want to then use predictive analytics. But the challenge is it's really high in terms of complexity. So this is a continuum, and this is also the journey. So companies and individuals start with the lower complexity segmentation approach, and then typically go through the journey to work up to a behavior-based model where you're getting a lot of sophistication and a lot more return. In terms of getting the improved response, what is really going to keep the long tail, if you will, of those types of higher level 4-digit returns is when you get to behavior-based predictive analytics. But nobody starts there, and this is a journey. It's not a sprint. So I like to just talk about where we might start out. And this, by the way, is the difference between, you may hear structured data and unstructured data. Structured data being very black and white, fits into fields, and unstructured data, of course, would not, because it's capturing behavior, which is not a black and white category. That really is how data got so big. There's so much in the news around big data, and it's really around the complexity of going after behavior-based data. And what's so interesting and ironic is that although unstructured data is complex, I'm mentioning to you that it's very worthwhile. And one great example that I think we can all relate to is similar to Google flu trends. It's sort of that idea. The University of Rochester, New York, ran a one-month analysis, and they did this based on Twitter. They looked at about 4.5 million tweets and over 600,000 users. And basically what they did is created an algorithm that would look at the content of the tweets. And if it said something like, I'm going home sick with the flu versus I'm sick of work, they would segment those tweets. And they really measured with GPS tags around New York City who was getting sick with the flu. And the result was they were able, with this algorithm, to predict when healthy people were about to fall ill with a 90% accuracy rate and up to 8 days in advance. So if you think about that capability from unstructured data, you begin to realize how much is really in our hands to take advantage of. And I will tell you from personal experience that this benefit can be enjoyed from structured data as you move forward and then look at how you might capture unstructured data. For example, what is actually happening when you reach out to prospective donors? What is the behavior of your existing donor base, and what are they doing, and how can you use that to leverage how you communicate and connect with them in a much more effective manner? And that really brings us to challenge number 3, and that is data. But this is the one challenge that you really are able to control. Data is like the fuel, and analytics is the engine. So the challenge is that the data or the fuel needs to be mined, it needs to be gathered, it needs to be cleaned and processed. Oftentimes, data is in silos and difficult to access, and a lot of times it causes people to be paralyzed. But the truth is that the dirty little secret in all of our data is that we all have the same dirty little secret. It's tough to access. We never think we have enough. It's not cleaned enough. We have a portion of it. There might be duplicate records. For Zinram, Steve Zinram, and a host of, back some noise, a host of other issues that business folks are faced with. So everyone has the same issue. It's overcoming that issue that will really deliver the results. So, Steve, I just got a little message that you're on. If you'd like to make a comment, I'm going to pause for a moment.
Sorry about that, Sandy. I've been running around like crazy, and then I'm just not I was technically challenged. But you're dead right with this. You got to get to know your donors. And so many times we're all overwhelmed with the data you're talking about, but you do need to drill down and get to know your donors through the segmentations that you're talking about.
Great. Thank you, Steve. I'm glad you're on.
Thanks, Sandy.
So what I like to think about is how companies are actually working through some of the challenges of data and reaping tremendous rewards. And some of the public examples of this, maybe one of the cute examples here is with Caesars Entertainment. And the head of marketing for that corporation several years ago won a bunch of awards for his approach. And I love to highlight this example because it is extraordinary in terms of talking about an industry that is unlikely and results that are unlikely from someone who is committed to saying, I'm going to use data, I'm going to leverage the insights from this. So I think it's really relevant. The casino, Caesars Entertainment, is enormous. And they decided across their 52 properties that they would use a loyalty card, if you can believe it, to track 80% of spending in casino on property. And after they started to do this, they analyzed the data and they discovered really one amazing thing that they had no idea about before they analyzed the data. They discovered that 0.15% of their customers were generating 12% of their revenue. So they didn't even know they were missing this opportunity to connect on a white glove level with these very, very high value customers, very small percentage. And what's so cool to me is really then what they did with that data once they learned it. They decided for their high value customers that when they were on property and at the gambling tables, if they were having a less than positive experience in the casino, Caesars Entertainment deploys a luck ambassador who will go and intervene with a voucher for a restaurant or a show that they know that customer enjoys, so that they may leave the casino property with a very positive customer experience. And I think it's a great example of how a company can use data to see something that was not clear with the naked eye, but data gave them insights into something that was critically important and a very big lever in terms of their revenue or business.
So Sandy, last week you gave me you were going over that example with me, and you asked me, how does that relate to the nonprofit world? Do you remember that?
Yes.
Well, that really directly relates to us because we need to get to know our donors and our constituents. And by doing this similar type of approach of taking a look at how they're reacting as we're engaging with them, we can get to know our donors and be able to respond very similar to how Caesars Entertainment did. I thought your example was right on.
Thank you, Steve.
All right.
Yeah, it shows the power of data, which really, I have to tell you, I never understood a few years ago before I went on this journey, and now I continue to be amazed because 100% of the situations where I've been involved with companies who decide to leverage data, 100% of the results have been positive, and I've seen a minimum improvement of a 2-digit. So it's really powerful. And it doesn't take a lot, but the issue is really around how to get started. That is what we all struggle with. So what I like to talk about is a simple, still 6-step program that gets us out of this sort of paralysis, which I am guilty of being in as well, and really gets us going in terms of implementation. So breaking this down into some simple starting points so that we can really begin this journey forward, because it's going to be very worthwhile. So what I have is a continuous loop, and that's because you start on this journey, but it's really something that you develop iteratively, and you grow, and you really start with one step forward, one trip around the circle, and you expand from there. So step 1, to me, is very basic and very important. It's really that you know what your objective is. So I remember in school talking about objectives being SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, time-limited, and realistic. So setting an objective is very important. Step 2 is really around gathering the data. As I mentioned, this is our fuel, and most everyone can start with exactly what they have today. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Step 3 is our engine. This is where we put the data in and really analyze and model so that we have something of value coming out. Step 4 is where we use that information to then strategize and make the plan. Step 5 is where we're going to execute. And step 6 is where we're going to measure and adjust. We'll learn to do it over, learn to get smarter, and go again. So I'm going to go through each of those steps now. So step number 1 around the objective, I want to make this simple. I believe that we can really talk about this in terms of new donor acquisition, growing existing donors, retaining donors who might have a propensity to disengage, or reactivating donors who maybe gave in the past and stopped giving for some reason or other. If you look at these objectives, acquisition is about 5 to 7 times the cost of all of the other initiatives. So while marketers, for example, typically allocate about 80 to 90% of their budgets on acquisition, there is a lot of gold, if you will, in the bottom 3 objectives of growing existing donors, retaining, or reactivating. So I just challenge everyone on the call to think about one objective for one campaign, but overall, as you're trying to grow your fundraising and your revenue base, you think about a multi-pronged approach, which you're probably taking already, that would involve new donor acquisition, but also really maximizing your current donor base and making sure that the donors you have in the fundraising pool stay in the fundraising pool and are really maximized or optimized. So that is setting your objective. So if we choose one campaign that is upcoming for fundraising and we set our objective with a very clear goal, numerical results, we then can go to step 2. And this is gather data. And I would say that this is where a lot of us feel that our data is different than everyone else. And I don't think that's the case at all. There are so many sources of data. You can look at internally, whether it's in a spreadsheet or a database or whatever format it's in, it's usable. You can augment your data with external sources by buying lists or buying records that can help deepen the information that you have around donors or prospective donors. I've worked with companies who have conducted surveys, mostly online, in order to gather data about their targets and what interests their targets. Of course, there's the traditional focus groups to learn more and get more qualitative depth. And then I've also seen one-on-one interviews. So these are some examples of how you can really gather data by using what you have in-house and or fortifying externally. Okay, step 3 is really analyzing the data. Now, we talked last week with fundraising around, before you analyze the data, how much data do you actually need? And I think the consensus was that if you have 5 very solid fields of data around each donor or prospective donor, you're going to have a rich source of data that can be analyzed and turned into insights that will really help you in your fundraising approach. So at this point, many companies and organizations will outsource the analysis of data because it's something that requires deep expertise, and a lot of organizations, frankly, don't really have that resource on staff. So it's great to go to an objective third party if that's something that works for you, especially in the starting stages so that you can start small. What I would say about analysis and modeling is one of the things that I did was use a 30-day spreadsheet. What I mean by that is 30 days worth of activity around a small segment of customers. And we used that as our only data input that we analyzed, and we based a campaign on that, and we're able to generate like a 35% improvement in revenue over business as usual. And the interesting thing about that is 30 days worth of behavioral data is nothing. And our analysis approach was very rudimentary, but still doing that produced exceptional results. And I think it goes back to the point I made earlier that it's not about the amount of data you have, it's about being able to see things that you cannot see with the naked eye. And data gives you that perspective and creates a single version of the truth and an objective view of your targets, the messaging, and the timing that you can deploy to get better engagement. The other thing that's really popular here is, thinking about cloud-based analytics and models so that you can take a very modular approach and really use something that allows you to put your toe in the water and grow from there. So step 4 is strategize, and this is really where you're ready to set up your campaign strategy. So you look at what the data has told you, and this is really where the art comes in. You're now going to design what your campaign will look like based on what the data points to. Who are the targets? What messages do they receive? And how are you going to measure the results? What I really encourage in the strategize phase is one must-have, and that is you set up what I call a test versus control. If you don't do a test versus control, you will never know in objective terms what improvement you can generate from data. So I like to say, here's statistically balanced groups, business as usual, versus here's data-driven messaging. And in my experience, we've tested groups 18,000 versus 18,000, up to 50,000 versus 50,000, and I've even done smaller, a few thousand versus a few thousand. The important point here is that you let your analytics resource or statistician balance the group so that you have a valid test and you know the real value of implementing a data-driven approach. Step 5 is really the campaign launch and execution. So what I like to emphasize here is that you really want to set an end date for tallying results. For me, the typical response window, although you measure it daily, really cuts off around 30 days. Some go for 60 days. But what's important here is that you do measure daily. One campaign I did, because we measured daily, we learned something that we had no idea was happening until after the campaign. And that was on the data-driven campaign, we received responses, 50% of the responses in the first 2 weeks of the campaign versus the business as usual, where we only got 2% of the responses in 2 weeks. And for that specific client, there was a huge cash flow implication because they were generating revenue in the first 2 weeks from 50%, and that had a big impact on the campaign results and really on their business. Steve, did you have a comment here?
Actually, Sandy, I did. We've been using a lot of the same approach that you're talking about, and I know that we talked about this last week. And by focusing our attention on our donors and our previously what we in the business call SIBUNs, just recently lapsed donors, we focus 70% of our budget on them and only 30% on our non-donors. And by using the strategy that you're talking about, we actually retained 78% of our donors last year, and we reacquired 35% of our lapsed donors, and immediately from there saw growth. Now, we did see growth, of course, in some non-donors by making them donors, but our focus is taking care of the folks that are already in our pipelines.
That is such a powerful example. I know I worked with a large hotel chain, and they did something similar, Steve. They were not going to look at their lapsed customers, and we said, let us just analyze that. And we did that, and we ran a campaign to those lapsed customers versus a campaign to currently engaged customers, and the lapsed customers actually outperformed the current customers, and we got re-engagement. And it was a really low-cost way to generate revenue and bring people back into the fold, because if they've already donated, they're already interested.
And Sandy,
so
when you did that, did you ask them why they were coming back or what made them not give before so you could learn from that?
Yeah.
Yeah, we
absolutely.
did that a lot last year. We had those conversations with them. We actually sent them a survey, asked them, what had happened and why, what had we done to get them back. And we learned quite a bit of information from doing that and are able to incorporate that in this year's campaigns. So we've actually decreased the amount of money that we're spending on getting new donors. We're only shooting out to them a couple of times a year now and focusing our attention on retaining and reacquisition.
Sandra and Steve, just jumping in here real quick. A question
Sure, Ron.
from the floor, and I'm interested to know this as well, goes back to your point about picking the right number of factors or variables. You mentioned 8. I know when we were talking the other day, my bias is around 5, just because of the number of things people can keep in their heads. But someone asked, listening to you, there's a difference then between information about the donor as opposed to information about the donor's behavior. Any thoughts about what to pick and how to mix those two, or experiences related to that?
Well, I would say it really kind of depends on your organization and the information you're able to gather. I know here we have some, because we're coming from higher ed, we have some built-in information that we already know. But we try to gather information from when they're coming to many of our events and from the behaviors that we can pick up from there and enter into the system. And that tends to help us. It might be anything from, is there a certain academic department that they're relating to, or an affinity group that they're relating to, and we build that into our model. Sandy?
I believe it really depends where you are on the continuum. If you're just starting out, take the pressure off and just use structured data fields that might have zip code, gender, the other 5 solid fields. Start there with one campaign and do your side-by-side test. Look at the results. As you deploy further and further, maybe you apply this to additional campaigns. You are going to learn behavior and how people respond to campaigns that you can then capture, augment your database, and then have a richer source of data. So I believe it's a point in time. So your first campaigns would be 5 fields of structured data, sort of black and white stuff. You see how people react to that. What did the donors do? What are they doing when they're engaging with the campaign or going to an event? You augment your database and you build from there. So it's sort of this build that is a self-fulfilling, iterative approach that gets better and better over time. You just get smarter and smarter over time. That's a great point. And I think that, when people think about unstructured behavioral data, that's a big thing to sort of, swallow. That's the way I would recommend doing it.
Yeah, I think as you and I said the other day, get started. Even if you have to start with, even if it's just 5 or even 4, get started.
Yes. Last point I wanted to highlight, because Steve, you and I spoke about this, that I think was really critical in this reactivation approach, is the fact that many donors like to give on a seasonal basis. And so when I worked, for example, at the hotel chain, it relates exactly, Steve, to your example of how to reactivate donors, that the hotel chain or maybe in fundraising, you assume if someone has not responded or communicated for several months, they have left your organization, they have, abandoned their desire to continue to donate. That is not the case. In the hotel chain, what we found out was there were certain groups of customers that had a lot of seasonality to when they were going to stay and generate revenue, but there were long lapses in between where they wouldn't really communicate with the company. So that was a learning for me, and I think that, Steve, you mentioned there's a seasonality in your fundraising, and once you understood that, you could adjust your targets and the messaging accordingly to really help drive engagement.
Well, that was actually a discussion last year amongst our staff. We started taking a look at pockets of our donors. We started realizing that we have certain donors who donate every year in the fall, others who donate end of the calendar year for tax consequences, that December is the month they're going to give. Others, it's the April time zone when they're thinking right after their taxes, and other times it's right at the end of our fiscal year in June. So when we were able to identify them that this is when they give, that's when we did a very targeted approach to those individuals and had a better response rate. Did not mean that we weren't sending them information throughout the year. We most assuredly did, because we wanted to make sure that they were still in touch with us, still getting our information, but we sent them a very targeted, in most cases a direct mail piece, other times it was email, depended on the channel that they were also responding to. So it wasn't just timing, it was also what channel in the past have they given. We've been able to figure out that some of these people, it's just a habit. They will give via an email request every December or a letter sent to them every May, that they're going to respond.
Yep. Excellent. Thank you. So step 6, just to wrap it up, is measure, measure, measure. So you have to know what the finish line looks like in order to get better and improve from that. And with one example I mentioned earlier, Best Western, we started with 35 metrics. We ended up reporting on 5 of them. So your objectives will say, here's the things we want to accomplish. And then when you measure the results of this first campaign you're going to do, you know what it looks like to cross the finish line. And what I say is you must have one of the 3 R's in your metric: response, revenue, or ROI, ideally all 3. So that's really, to me, the power trio, if you will. So I mentioned earlier that in my experience, 100% of the implementation has produced positive results, minimum 2-digit uptick, and 0% of the organizations with whom I've worked have hit the reverse button. And I think this really speaks to the value that data can provide in really improving return on dollars, return on investment. And so what we're talking about here is really around doing something that's a little bit uncomfortable in order to get to much better results. And so just as a wrap-up, I want to leave a few minutes for questions. Your donor is really in control, knows it. You need to cut through that clutter and really figure out how to meet them on their terms with the right messaging, the right timing, the right channel. And the way to do that is really to use data, extract the insights to get very, very relevant, and that's where you're going to get the return on investment. And as mentioned, to me, this is proven in a lot of different industries and a lot of different geographies, and I have yet to see it fail. So with that, what I'd like to do is open the line to questions. So I'm going to take the attendees off of mute, and also you can enter questions on the chat window. If you have any comments or questions, Steve and I would welcome them at this time. So give me 1 second, and I'll hit the command to take everyone off of mute. Okay, the line should be open at this time. Are there any questions or comments?
Sandra and Steve, great job. I'm going to, we got a couple in during chat that I didn't interrupt you with, but I think are relevant, especially with the leave behind we're going to have here. The first one, and I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit, is which tools, and the paraphrase is cost effective in the nonprofit domain, do you recommend for data gathering and analysis?
Okay, great. I think that there are a lot of marketing automation tools and a lot of data gathering tools. So I think I would put it into three categories. First of all, for data gathering, I would look at what you have in-house, and then I would do a simple augment if you need to by doing an online survey as a place to start, or to do some simple phone interviews. For tools around analytics, well, I believe that there's a lot of companies that can provide analytics. I would look for one that understands nonprofit and fundraising and can really give a simple but effective solution to analyzing data and delivering that in a usable format. And then the third category, I would call it marketing automation, it's often called. This is where you're using tools to really manage the whole process. If you're just starting out, I would not recommend going there yet. If you are more sophisticated, there are a number of software tools. I won't mention the specific companies, but they're very easy to find in terms of automation tools that can help you manage the entire process.
Yeah, I would concur with that, exactly what you said, Sandy. When it comes to gathering information, we did a lot of it in-house ourselves at first, and we did do the online surveys, and we continue to do that. We also try to do a lot of surveying and fact gathering at our events. When we host little events around the country or even on campus, our staff is out gathering information and entering it.
I think that's a great point, Steve, is that data is not necessarily data that comes in online for analysis, but data that you capture in conversations and any touch point you have with your constituents.
Well, and so many times, Ron, it could be information from our receptionist. Just information she's getting from when she's picking up the phone and talking to somebody on the other end, or when somebody comes in through the door. We're very lucky. We have a receptionist who's very good at entering the information for us and giving us that feedback.
Okay, another question for both of you. Our request for some examples of nonprofits that have created relevance or used relevance to increase donor revenue.
Steve, I'll let you start with that one.
I'm sorry, Ron, could you repeat that? It was breaking up a little bit. I'm sorry.
Sure. Examples of nonprofits that have used or created relevance to increase donor revenue.
Well, I mean, I think you can take a look at any of the large nonprofits, but if you want to take a look at some of the local regional ones, I know here the Cleveland Museum of Art has done a wonderful job with gathering information and making it more relevant to their donors. I know we have done a lot of it in the last year, and a lot of it is image building, and a lot of it is gathering the information from our donors and trying to apply it to our messaging.
We may have some folks on the call from Denver Center of the Performing Arts, and I think they're a great example of an organization who's really looking at data to improve fundraising as well as to improve engagement around ticket sales. And one of the interesting things I know we've talked about is connecting. You mentioned the Cleveland Museum of Art, Steve, but connecting through the different art organizations. So you might have the Art Museum, the Performing Arts, and other organizations who are really connecting the data sources so that there is going to be a richer outreach and a more targeted outreach and less messaging from the arts in order to really improve engagement. I think that's another example of how industry-based, if you will, data-driven approaches are really going to develop over time and get better and better over time.
Thanks. And last question, actually, since we still have the lines open, are there any questions from our attendees before we get to this last one, because it segues well into our wrap-up? All right, then that last one that came in via chat, I think we'll answer through our wrap-up, and that's where should I start in creating brand relevance for my organization. And we'll follow up this presentation with a tip sheet that we've created called 5 Tips for Creating Relevant Content, which we will send to the attendees of the webinar within 24 hours, and we encourage you to forward those on or give us feedback on those. I want to thank you all for joining us, and thanks to Sandra Zoratti and Steve Zinram for presenting.
Thank you so much, Ron. Thank you to everyone who attended. I sure appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ron, and everyone. Thank you.
All right, again, I'm Ron Cass, founder of Big River, and we wish you all a good day. Thanks for attending the webcast today and taking the time, and we look forward to following up with you and you attending a future webcast in this series of bringing the best practices of e-commerce to the nonprofit space. Take care, all. Thanks for your time today.